The Zero was coming straight at me, its machine guns winking like deadly fireflies in the dawn light. My hands were slick with sweat on the stick of my P-400 Airacobra, and I could hear the Japanese bullets snapping past my canopy like angry hornets. Below us, the blue waters of Ironbottom Sound stretched endlessly, littered with the twisted metal graves of ships from both sides. I had maybe 3 seconds before that Zero pilot would line up his shot and send me to join them on the ocean floor. 3 seconds to prove that an American pilot in the wrong plane could still beat the best the Japanese had to offer. My name is Lieutenant Jack Morrison, United States Marine Corps, and this is the story of how a bunch of misfit pilots flying cast-off fighters held the line at Guadalcanal when the whole Pacific War hung in the balance. It was August 20th, 1942, and I was standing on the steel deck of a Navy transport ship, watching the green hills of Guadalcanal rise from the morning mist like something out of a fever dream. The tropical air hit my lungs thick and humid, carrying the smell of rotting vegetation and cordite from the recent fighting. Somewhere in those jungle-covered ridges, American Marines were digging in around a half-finished airstrip they'd captured from the Japanese just weeks before. "Beautiful, ain't it?" said Captain Bill Morrison, no relation, despite the name, as he joined me at the rail. Morrison commanded our squadron, VMF-223, and he had the kind of weathered face that comes from too many years squinting into bright skies. Course, the Japs think it's beautiful too. That's why they keep trying to take it back. Behind us, the ship's cargo cranes were already swinging into action, lifting our precious fighters from the hold. But as I watched those planes emerge into the sunlight, my heart sank a little deeper with each one. They were P-400 Airacobras, export versions of the Army's P-39 that the British had rejected and passed back to us like unwanted Christmas presents. "Sir," I said, trying to keep the disappointment out of my voice, "I thought we were getting F-4F Wildcats." Morrison spat over the side. "You and me both, Lieutenant. But the Navy needs every Wildcat they can get for their carriers. So we get the hand-me-downs." He clapped me on the shoulder. "Don't worry, Morrison. These Airacobras might not be much above 15,000 feet, but down low where we'll be fighting, they're not half bad. Besides, it ain't the plane that wins the fight. It's the pilot." I wanted to believe him. The P-400 was a sleek-looking aircraft, I'll give it that. Painted in olive drab and gray, with its distinctive tricycle landing gear and that big 37mm cannon mounted in nose, it looked fast and dangerous. But looks don't win dogfights, and every pilot in the Pacific knew the stories about the legendary Japanese Zero, faster, more maneuverable, and flown by some of the most experienced combat pilots in the world. The airstrip they'd named Henderson Field was nothing more than a roughly graded dirt runway hacked out of a coconut plantation. As our transport truck bounced and lurched along the muddy road from the beach, I got my first real look at our new home. Tattered palm trees stood like broken umbrellas over scattered piles of equipment and supplies. Marines in sweat-stained dungarees were still dragging sections of Japanese steel runway, matting into position, working under the broiling sun with the kind of grim determination that meant they knew their lives depended on getting planes into the air as quickly as possible, muttered Sergeant Tommy Kowalski, my wingman, as we passed a line of fresh graves marked with crude wooden crosses. "How many boys we already lost here?" "Too many," said Morrison grimly. "And we're gonna lose more before this is over. The Japs hit this place every day, sometimes twice a day. Their bombers come down from Rabaul every morning at 11:30, regular as clockwork. The boys call it the noon balloon. Then their fighters strafe us in the afternoon. At night, their Navy comes down the slot and pounds us with battleships and cruisers." I felt my mouth go dry. "Every day?" "Every day. That's why we're here, Lieutenant. Somebody's got to stop them, and right now, we're all there is." The tent that would serve as our squadron operations center was a patched canvas affair that looked like it might blow away in the next strong wind. Inside, Major John L. Smith, commanding officer of VMF-223, was hunched over a crude map table, plotting defensive positions with a stub of pencil. Smith was a thin, intense man with pale eyes that seemed to take in everything at once. He'd already been on Guadalcanal for 2 weeks, and the strain was showing in the lines around those eyes. "Gentlemen," he said without looking up, "welcome to paradise. I hope you enjoyed your sea cruise, because the relaxation portion of your tour is now officially over." He straightened up and fixed us with that pale stare. "Tomorrow morning at 0800, the Japanese are going to try to blow this airfield off the map. They'll come in with 20 or 30 bombers, escorted by maybe 40 Zeros. Our job is to stop them." "How many planes do we have, sir?" asked Morrison. 14 P-400s and 5 F-4F Wildcats. The Wildcats belong to VMF-224 under Major Robert Gaylor. They'll take the high cover, try to bounce the bombers. We get the dirty work, tangling with the Zeros down low. The math was ugly any way you looked at it. 40-plus Japanese fighters against 14 American ones, and we'd be flying planes that weren't even designed for air-to-air combat. But that was the hand we'd been dealt, and Marines don't fold just because the odds are bad. "Any questions?" Smith asked. I raised my hand. "Sir, what about reinforcements? Are more planes coming?" Smith's smile was thin as a knife blade. "Son, we are the reinforcements. The closest American fighters are in Australia, and the Navy's too busy keeping the Japanese fleet from steaming into Pearl Harbor to spare us any more carriers. For now, we're on our own." That night, I lay in my cot listening to the rain drumming on the canvas and trying not to think about tomorrow. Somewhere out in the darkness, I could hear the rumble of distant thunder, or maybe it was Japanese warships shelling our positions from offshore. In this place, it was hard to tell the difference. The attack came exactly when Major Smith said it would. At 11:15 a.m. on August 21, 1942, our coast watchers radioed in the warning. Condition read, "Large formation of bandits approaching from the northwest. Angels 25. I was already strapped into my P-400, engine warming, when the call came over the radio. Around me, the other pilots of VMF-223 were going through their final checks with the mechanical precision of men who knew their lives depended on getting every detail right. The morning air was thick with humidity and the smell of aviation fuel. "Cactus flight, this is Cactus Control," crackled the voice of our ground controller. "Bandits inbound, bearing 320, Angels 25, distance 50 miles and closing. You are cleared for immediate takeoff." "Roger, Cactus Control." Cactus flight rolling. The P-400's Allison engine roared as I released the brakes and started my takeoff roll. The rough dirt runway flashed beneath my wheels, and then I was airborne, climbing steeply into the brilliant blue sky over Guadalcanal. Behind me, 13 other Airacobras formed up in loose formation, their olive drab paint schemes almost invisible against the jungle canopy below. "There they are," Morrison's voice crackled over the radio. "Look at them all." I followed his gaze to the northwest and felt my blood turn to ice water. The Japanese formation was a sight to behold, a perfect V of twin-engine bombers surrounded by a swarm of fighters that looked like angry wasps in the distance. There had towed at least 27 Betty bombers in tight formation, with maybe 36 Zeros weaving protective patterns around them. "Cactus flight, this is Dumbo-led," came the voice of Major Gaylor in his F-4F Wildcat. "We're going for the bombers. You boys keep those Zeros off our backs." "Roger," Dumbo-led. "We'll try to keep them busy." At 15,000 feet, my P-400 was already starting to feel sluggish in the thin air. The supercharger on the Allison engine wasn't designed for high-altitude work, and I could feel the plane's response getting mushy as we climbed to meet the enemy. The Zeros, on the other hand, seemed to dance through the air like deadly ballerinas, completely at home in the thin atmosphere. The first Zero dove on us out of the sun, its machine guns chattering. Tracer round streaked past my canopy as I yanked the stick hard left and dove for the deck. The Japanese pilot was good, better than good, and he stayed with me through the turn, lining up for another burst. "Morrison, you got one on your tail." Kowalski's voice was tight with adrenaline. "I see him. I see him." I rolled inverted and pulled back on the stick, using gravity to help my sluggish fighter pick up speed. The Zero followed, but now we were down at 8,000 feet, and suddenly my P-400 came alive. The thick air filled the engine with power, and I could feel the airplane's true nature asserting itself. The Japanese pilot made his mistake when he tried to follow me through a high G turn at low altitude. The Zero was lighter and more maneuverable, but it was also more fragile. I heard his engine start to wheeze as the G-forces took their toll, and I saw my chance. Rolling out of the turn, I lined up behind him and squeezed the trigger. The big 37mm cannon in my nose barked once, twice, and the second shell took the Zero right in the engine. The fighter exploded in a ball of orange flame and black smoke, pieces of wing and fuselage spinning toward the jungle below. "Splash 10." I yelled into my radio, but there was no time to celebrate. Two more Japanese fighters were diving on me from above, their wings twinkling with muzzle flashes. The dogfight that followed was like nothing I'd ever experienced in training. The sky was full of twisting, turning aircraft, the air crisscrossed with tracer fire and the black smoke of burning planes. Below us, the Japanese bombers droned on toward Henderson Field in their perfect formation, protected by what seemed like an impenetrable screen of fighters. "Dumbo 3 going down." The voice over the radio was calm, professional, even as the pilot reported his own death. "Engines hit. Can't maintain altitude." I caught a glimpse of Major Gaylor's Wildcat spinning earthward, smoke streaming from its cowling. A parachute blossomed in the sky. At least he'd gotten out. But that was one less American fighter in the air, and the Japanese still had dozens of planes left. The bombers reached their target and began their attack runs. From 5 miles away, I could see the explosions blooming like deadly flowers across Henderson Field. Fuel dumps went up in towering columns of black smoke. Repair shops and supply tents vanished in sheets of flame. The crude runway disappeared under a blanket of bomb bursts and debris. "They're tearing the field apart." Morrison's voice was grim over the radio. "We got to stop those bombers." But stopping them was easier said than done. Every time one of us tried to break through to attack the bombers, 3 or 4 Zeros would pounce. The Japanese pilots were aggressive and skilled, using their superior numbers to keep us tied up in individual dogfights while their bombers methodically destroyed our base. I found myself in a turning fight with a Zero piloted by someone who clearly knew what he was doing. We spiraled around each other like a pair of deadly dancers, each trying to get inside the other's stern for a killing shot. The Japanese pilot was good, maybe better than me, but he made the mistake of trying to climb. At 12,000 feet, his Zero still had the advantage. But I kept my P-400 down in the thick air where it belonged, forcing him to come down to me if he wanted the fight. When he finally dove, I was ready. The 37mm cannon was a devastating weapon when it connected. My first shot missed, but the second one didn't. The explosive shell hit the Zero just behind the cockpit, and the lightweight fighter simply came apart. One moment it was a sleek instrument of war. The next it was a cloud of debris tumbling toward the ocean. "That's 2, I muttered, but the satisfaction was short-lived. Looking around, I realized the sky was suddenly much emptier than it had been a few minutes earlier. Most of the Japanese bombers had already completed their runs and were heading back northwest toward their base at Rabaul. The surviving Zeros were forming up as escort, and several of them were showing damage from the fight. But we'd paid a price too. Of the 14 P-400s that had taken off that morning, only 9 were still airborne. The others were either shot down or so badly damaged they'd been forced to land at Henderson Field, if there was enough runway left to land on. As we circled back toward base, I got my first good look at what the Japanese bombers had accomplished. Henderson Field looked like the surface of the moon. Craters pockmarked the runway, and black smoke rose from a dozen fires. The operations tent was gone, replaced by a shallow crater. Half of our fuel supply was burning in a pillar of flame that reached 1,000 feet into the sky. Cactus flight, this is Cactus Control, came a weary voice over the radio. Emergency landing procedures in effect. Runway is partially operational. Land at your own risk. Landing on Henderson Field that day was like threading a needle in an earthquake. The runway was so pocked with bomb craters that our ground crews had to guide us between the holes with colored flags. My P-400's left main gear collapsed as I touched down, sending the fighter skidding sideways in a shower of sparks and dirt. But I was alive, and the plane could be repaired. As I climbed out of the cockpit, Captain Morrison jogged over, his face streaked with smoke and dirt. "You okay, Jack?" "Yeah, I'm fine." "What's the damage report?" His expression was grim. "We lost 5 planes and 3 pilots. The Japs lost maybe 8 or 10 fighters and 1 bomber. They'll call that a victory." WW2. They knocked out about 60% of our fuel supply and most of our repair facilities. But the runway's still operational, barely. The Seabees are already working to fill in the craters. I looked around at the devastation and shook my head. How long can we keep this up? Morrison clapped me on the shoulder. "As long as we have to. Son, as long as we have to." The Japanese came back the next day, and the day after that, and every day for the next 2 weeks. By September 5, 1942, the routine had become as predictable as sunrise. Every morning at exactly 11:30 a.m., our coast watchers would radio the warning, "Condition red. Bandits inbound." Then we'd scramble whatever planes we had left and try to stop them. The numbers changed from day to day, but the pattern was always the same. 20 to 30 Japanese bombers escorted by 30 to 40 Zeros, coming down from their base at Rabaul to pound Henderson Field into scrap metal. Our job was to get between them and their target, using whatever flyable aircraft we could scrape together. Some days we had 12 planes. Some days we had 6. On September 3rd, we got exactly 3 P-400s and 1 Wildcat into the air to face 36 Japanese aircraft. The math never got any better, but somehow we were holding the line. "You know what I figured out?" said Tommy Kowalski as we sat in our makeshift ready tent, waiting for the morning raid that we knew was coming. It was September 11th, and Tommy was down to his last clean flight suit. We were all running low on everything: uniforms, soap, ammunition, hope. "What's that, Tommy?" "The Japs ain't trying to destroy the airfield anymore. They're trying to destroy us. They figure if they kill enough pilots, we won't be able to put up any kind of fight when their big invasion comes." He was probably right. The Japanese had been landing troops on Guadalcanal almost every night, reinforcing their garrison in the hills around Henderson Field. Everyone knew a major attack was coming, and when it did, our handful of beat-up fighters would be all that stood between the Japanese army and complete control of the island. "Well then," I said, checking my .45 pistol for the 10th time that morning, "I guess we better not let them kill us." Tommy laughed, but it was a hollow sound. We'd both seen too many good men die over the past 3 weeks. Pilots who'd shared jokes with us at breakfast were gone by dinner, their planes twisted wrecks in the jungle or at the bottom of Ironbottom Sound. The replacement pilots who occasionally made it through were green kids straight from flight school, and they rarely lasted more than a few missions. But veterans who were left, the survivors, had learned a few tricks. Condition red. Condition red. All pilots to aircraft. The familiar call sent us running toward our planes. I'd been assigned a new P-400 after my first one was ridden off in a landing accident. This one was named Rebel Yell and had a cartoon Confederate soldier painted on the nose, some Army pilot's idea of humor before the plane was passed down to the Marines. As I strapped in and ran through my pre-flight checklist, I could see the other members of what was left of VMF-223 preparing for takeoff. We were down to 8 operational aircraft now, and 2 of those were so shot up they could barely get off the ground. But Major Smith had worked out new tactics that played to our strengths and minimized our weaknesses. "Cactus Flight, form up on me," Smith's voice crackled over the radio as we lifted off. "Remember, we stay low and fast. Hit them hard and get out. Don't try to turn with the Zeros. Use your speed and firepower." The Japanese formation was smaller today, only 18 bombers with about 24 escorts. Maybe they were running short of planes and pilots too. Or maybe this was just the advance guard for something bigger. "There they are," called Captain Morrison. "Looks like they're going for the runway again." "Roger. Cactus 2 and 3, take the left side. 4 and 5, right side. 6 through 8, stay with me. We're going straight up the middle." What followed was 3 minutes of pure chaos. The Japanese fighters dove to meet us head-on, their wing guns sparkling with muzzle flashes. But this time we were ready for them. Instead of trying to dogfight, we used our superior diving speed to slash through their formation, firing quick bursts, and then diving away before they could react. My first pass took me straight through a formation of 3 Zeros. The big 37mm cannon spoke once, and the lead fighters simply disintegrated. The 2 wingmen scattered, but they were flying defensively now instead of attacking, and that gave our bombers a clear shot at the enemy formation. "Splash one Betty," called Lieutenant Williams as this burst of cannon fire sent one of the Japanese bombers spinning toward the ocean, trailing smoke and flame. "Got another one." That was Sergeant Martinez, our newest replacement pilot, sounding amazed that he was still alive. The Japanese bombers that made it through dropped their loads, but the damage was light compared to previous raids. A few craters in the runway, some damage to the repair shops, but nothing that would shut down the field for more than a few hours. As the enemy formation headed back toward Rabaul, I did a quick count of the aircraft around me. All 8 P-400s were still airborne, though Williams' plane was streaming coolant and would need an emergency landing. The Japanese, on the other hand, had lost at least 4 bombers and 6 fighters. "Not bad," said Major Smith over the radio. "Not bad at all. But stay alert. Intelligence says there might be another raid this afternoon." There was, and another one the next day. But each time we were getting a little bit better at our job, and the Japanese were getting a little bit weaker. September 13, 1942, dawn gray and overcast, with low clouds hanging over Henderson Field like a funeral shroud. I should have known it was going to be a bad day. "This is it, boys," Major Smith told us during the morning briefing. "Intelligence says the Japs are going to throw everything they've got at us today. Maybe 60 bombers with 100 fighters. They want to knock out this airfield once and for all before their big ground offensive starts." I felt my stomach clench. 100 Japanese fighters. We had 9 operational P-400s and 3 Wildcats. Even if every shot we fired found its mark, the math didn't work. "Sir," asked Captain Morrison, "what about reinforcements?" "Any word from Comsopac?" Smith shook his head. "We're what we've got, Captain. Admiral Gormley can't spare any more carriers, and the Army Air Forces are still getting organized in Australia. For now, Guadalcanal is our fight." The waiting was always the worst part. Sitting in the cockpit, engine idling, waiting for the call that would send us up to face impossible odds. Around me, the other pilots went through their own pre-combat rituals. Some prayed. Some checked and rechecked their guns. Tommy Kowalski was writing what looked like a letter, probably to his girl back in Chicago. "You okay, Jack?" he asked, noticing me watching him. "Yeah, I'm fine." "You?" He folded the letter and tucked it into his flight jacket. "Just getting my affairs in order, you know. In case today's the day." I knew what he meant. Every pilot in combat thinks about it, the possibility that today's mission might be your last. But thinking about it and accepting it are two different things, and I wasn't ready to accept anything yet. Condition red. Condition red. Estimated 40-plus bandits inbound, bearing 320. The call came at 11:15, 15 minutes earlier than usual. Either the Japanese were changing their tactics, or our coast watchers had spotted them sooner than normal. Cactus flight. This is Cactus control. You are cleared for immediate takeoff. Dumbo flight will provide high cover. Good luck. The P-400's engine roared to life as I released the brakes and started my takeoff roll. The rough dirt runway flashed beneath my wheels, and then I was climbing steeply into the overcast sky, following Major Smith's lead aircraft toward what might be our final battle. We broke through the cloud layer at 8,000 feet, and that's when I saw them. The intelligence report had been wrong. It wasn't 40 bombers. It was at least 50, flying in perfect formation toward Henderson Field. And around them, like a protective swarm of deadly insects, were more Zero fighters than I'd ever seen in one place. Mary and Joseph, breathed Captain Morrison over the radio. There must be 80 fighters up there. I count at least that many, replied Smith grimly. All right, boys, you know the drill. Hit them fast, hit them hard, and don't try to be heroes. Our job is to break up their formation and give the ground defenses a chance. The Japanese fighters saw us coming and dove to meet us. What followed was the most intense aerial combat I'd ever experienced. The sky filled with twisting, turning aircraft, tracer fire crisscrossing in deadly patterns, and the thunder of engines pushed to their limits. My first engagement was with a Zero piloted by someone who was clearly experienced. He came at me head-on, his wing guns chattering, and I had to roll inverted and dive to avoid his fire. But as I pulled out of the dive, another Zero was waiting, and then another. For the next 10 minutes, I was fighting for my life against 3 Japanese fighters at once. They worked as a team, taking turns attacking while the others positioned for follow-up shots. It was masterful flying, and if I'd been in any other aircraft, they would have killed me in the first 2 minutes. But the P-400, for all its faults, was a tough airplane. It could absorb punishment that would have destroyed a lighter fighter, and its heavy armament could inflict devastating damage when it connected. When one-off Zeros made the mistake of crossing in front of my guns, the 37mm cannon blew it to pieces with a single shot. Splash 10, I called, but there was no time for celebration. The other 2 were still there, still trying to kill me, and now they were angry. All around me, the air battle raged. I caught glimpses of other P-400s engaged in desperate dogfights, their pilots using every trick they knew to stay alive against overwhelming odds. Tommy Kowalski flashed past, pursued by 2 Zeros, his plane streaming smoke from several bullet holes. Tommy, you okay? Engine's running rough, but I'm still flying. Look out, Jack, you got one coming down on you from 2 o'clock high. I rolled left just in time to avoid a burst of cannon fire that would have cut my fighter in half. The Zero that had fired at me flashed past, and I saw my chance. Rolling out behind him, I lined up my shot and squeezed the trigger. The big cannon barked once, and the Zero's right wing folded up like a closing fan. The fighter rolled over and dove straight into the jungle below, leaving a pillar of black smoke to mark its grave. But the Japanese bombers were getting through. Despite our efforts, most of the formation was reaching Henderson Field and beginning their attack runs. From 20,000 feet, I could see the bombs falling like deadly rain, exploding across the runway and the surrounding facilities in a continuous chain of destruction. They're hitting everything. Major Smith's voice was tight with frustration. Runway, fuel dumps, maintenance shops, they're trying to put us out of business permanently. He was right. This wasn't just another raid. It was an all-out attempt to destroy Henderson Field as an operational base. If they succeeded, there would be nothing to stop the Japanese from landing their invasion fleet and retaking Guadalcanal. All Cactus aircraft, this is Cactus Control, came a new voice over the radio, calm, professional, but with an undertone of desperation. We need you to stop those bombers. Repeat, you must stop those bombers. The field cannot sustain much more damage. But stopping them was easier said than done. Every time we tried to break through to the bomber formation, the escort fighters pounced. The Japanese pilots were skilled and aggressive, using their superior numbers to keep us tied up in individual dogfights while their bombers methodically destroyed our base. I was in a turning fight with my third Zero of the day when I saw Tommy Kowalski's P-400 take a direct hit from a 20mm cannon. The shell exploded in his cockpit, and his fighter rolled over and began a long, smoking dive toward the ocean. Tommy, get out of there. But there was no response on the radio, and no parachute appeared above the dying aircraft. Tommy Kowalski, who'd written letters to his girl from Chicago and dreamed of going home to marry her, was gone. The rage that filled me then was like nothing I'd ever experienced. This wasn't about tactics anymore, or even survival. It was personal. I broke off from the Zero I was fighting and dove toward the bomber formation, determined to make the Japanese pay for Tommy's death. The escort fighters tried to stop me, but I was flying like a man possessed. I rolled and dove and climbed through their formation, ignoring the bullets that punched holes in my wings and fuselage, focused only on reaching those bombers. When I finally broke through, I found myself alone in the middle of 50 Japanese bombers, their gunners already swinging their weapons toward my lone fighter. But I was in the perfect position for what the P-400 was designed to do, attack bombers with that massive 37mm cannon. My first shot took the lead bomber in the engine. The big shell punched through the cowling and exploded inside the nacelle, sending the Betty spinning out of formation with one wing on fire. My second shot hit another bomber in the bomb bay, and the aircraft simply vanished in a ball of orange flame as its own ordnance detonated. The bomber gunners were firing at me now, their tracers creating a web of deadly light around my aircraft. I felt bullets hitting my plane, heard the sharp crack of shells punching through aluminum, but somehow I kept flying. The P-400 was tougher than anyone had given it credit for. I got 2 more bombers before the escort fighters caught up with me. A Zero dove on me from above, its guns blazing, and I felt my engine start to miss as bullets found their mark. Oil began streaming back over my windscreen, and the engine temperature gauge climbed rapidly into the red. Cactus 7, you're on fire. Major Smith's voice crackled over the radio. Get out of there, Jack. Head for home. But I wasn't ready to head home yet. Not with Tommy dead and the Japanese still bombing our field. I stayed with the formation, using my dying engine to make one more attack run. The 5th bomber I hit was a big Mitsubishi G4M, its bomb bay doors already open for the attack run. When my 37mm shell punched through the fuselage just behind the cockpit, the aircraft broke in half and fell toward Henderson Field like a broken toy. That's when my engine finally quit. The Allison seized with a grinding screech of tortured metal, and my propeller windmilled to a stop. Suddenly, my P-400 was a glider, and not a very good one. Mayday, mayday. Cactus 7 going down, engine out, attempting dead stick landing at Henderson. The Japanese fighters were still around me, but they seemed to have lost interest in a dead aircraft. I was no longer a threat to their bombers, so they left me alone to glide toward the burning airfield below. Henderson Field looked like hell on earth. Smoke rose from a dozen fires, and the runway was so cratered it looked like the surface of the moon. But it was still the only place I had a chance of landing, so I lined up on what was left off the main strip and hoped for the best. The landing was more of a controlled crash. Without engine power, I came in too fast and too steep, bouncing twice before the damaged landing gear finally collapsed and sent my fighter sliding sideways across the rough dirt in a shower of sparks. When the plane finally stopped moving, I was alive but shaken. My hands were trembling as I unstrapped from the cockpit and climbed out onto the wing. Around me, the air was thick with smoke and the smell of burning aviation fuel. "You okay, Lieutenant?" I looked up to see a Marine corpsman running toward me, his medical bag bouncing against his hip. Behind him came the fire truck, its crew already unreeling hoses to deal with any flames. "Yeah, I think so." "What's the damage report?" "The field's still operational, barely. They got most of our fuel supplies and knocked out 2 more repair shops, but the runway's still open. Your squadron shot down a bunch of their bombers, maybe 8 or 10. The Japs are already heading home. 8 or 10 bombers. It didn't seem like much against the 50 that had attacked us, but it was something. And more importantly, Henderson Field was still in American hands. As I walked across the cratered runway toward the operations tent, I did a mental count of the pilots I'd seen return. Major Smith was back, his plane shot up but flyable. Captain Morrison had made it down safely, but several faces were missing from the group gathered around the debriefing table. Tommy Kowalski wasn't the only one we'd lost that day. October 25th, 1942. The date is burned into my memory like a brand because it was the day we finally broke the back of Japanese air power over Guadalcanal. It had been 6 weeks since that devastating raid in September, and both sides had used the time to rebuild and reinforce. The Japanese had sent down fresh squadrons of fighters and bombers from Rabaul, along with some of their best pilots. We'd received replacements too, new P-400s, a few more Wildcats, and pilots fresh from the States who still thought war was some kind of grand adventure. But the real change was in us, the survivors. The dozen or so pilots who'd lived through 2 months of daily combat had learned lessons you can't teach in flight school. We'd learned to use our aircraft's strengths and work around its weaknesses. We'd learned to fight as a team, to trust each other completely, and to never give the enemy an even break. Most importantly, we'd learned that we could win. Today's different, Major Smith told us during the morning briefing. Intelligence says the Japs are planning something big, maybe their final push to retake the island. But they've got to knock out our air power first, so they're throwing everything they have at us. He pointed to the large map of the Solomon Islands chain that covered one wall of our operations tent. Red pins marked known Japanese air bases, while blue pins showed our own positions. Henderson Field and the smaller fighter strips that had been carved out of the jungle over the past month. Coast Watchers report at least 70 bombers forming up over Rabaul, with maybe 120 fighters as escort. That's nearly 200 enemy aircraft heading our way. I felt the familiar tightness in my gut that came before a big fight. 200 Japanese aircraft. We had maybe 30 operational fighters, P-400s, Wildcats, and a handful of Army P-38 Lightnings that had arrived the week before. "Sir," asked one of the new replacement pilots, a kid named Henderson who couldn't have been more than 21, "what are our chances?" Smith looked at him for a long moment, and I saw something flicker in those pale eyes, maybe sympathy, maybe envy for someone who still thought there were easy answers to hard questions. "Son," he said quietly, "our chances are what we make them. The Japanese have more planes and more pilots, but they've got to fly 300 miles from Rabaul to get here. They'll be low on fuel and tired from the flight. We'll be fighting over our own territory, with ground support and friendly airstrips if we need to land and rearm." He paused, scanning the faces of the pilots gathered around him. Some were veterans like me, men who'd been fighting since the early days and had the 1,000-yard stare that comes from seeing too much death. Others were replacements, their faces still soft with youth and inexperience. "But more than that," Smith continued, "we've got something they don't have. We know what we're fighting for. Every bomb they drop on Henderson Field, every bullet they fire at our aircraft, is one step closer to their invasion fleet steaming into these waters. If we don't stop them today, the Marines on the ground won't have air cover when the Japanese army comes calling. And if Guadalcanal falls, the whole Pacific War could be lost. The weight of that responsibility settled on all of us like a heavy blanket. It wasn't just our lives on the line. It was the lives of every Marine digging foxholes in the jungle, every sailor on the destroyers patrolling Ironbottom Sound, every American fighting the Japanese from Alaska to Australia. Any other questions? There were none. What else was there to ask? WEC knew our job, and we knew the stakes. The only thing left was to do it. Condition red. Condition red. Massive formation of bandits inbound, bearing 320, Angels 25. The call came at 10:45 a.m., 45 minutes earlier than the usual Japanese attacks. They were changing their tactics, trying to catch us off guard. But we were ready. I strapped into my P-400, a different aircraft than the one I'd flown in September, but painted with the same rebel yell, nose art, and ran through my pre-flight checklist with practiced efficiency. Around me, the other pilots of VMF-223 were going through their own preparations, the routine so familiar now that we could do it in our sleep. Cactus flight, this is Cactus Control, crackled the voice of our ground controller. Bandits now bearing 310, Angels 25, estimated 150-plus aircraft. You are cleared for immediate takeoff. 150-plus. Even more than intelligence had predicted. But there was no time to think about the odds. The Allison engine roared to life as I released the brakes and started my takeoff roll. Henderson Field flashed beneath my wheels, and then I was climbing steeply into the clear blue sky over Guadalcanal. Behind me, 29 other American fighters formed up in loose formation, P-400s, Wildcats, and the new P-38s with their distinctive twin booms and central nacelles. There they are, came Major Smith's voice over the radio, calm and professional as always. Look at them all. The Japanese formation filled the northwestern sky like a dark cloud. Twin-engine bombers flew in perfect V formations, their aluminum skin glinting in the tropical sun. Around them, like a protective swarm of insects, were more Zero fighters than I'd ever seen in one place, sleek, deadly aircraft flown by pilots who'd been honing their skills since the war began. All right, boys, Smith's voice crackled over the radio. This is what we've been training for. P-38s take high cover and go for the bombers. Wildcats take medium altitude. P-400s, you're with me, will hit the escort fighters low and fast. Roger, Cactus led. Cactus 7 ready. The next 30 minutes were the most intense of my life. The Japanese fighters dove to meet us, their wing guns sparkling with muzzle flashes, and suddenly the sky was full of twisting, turning aircraft locked in mortal combat. My first engagement was with a Zero piloted by someone who was clearly a veteran. He came at me in a perfect high side pass, his 20mm cannons chattering, and I had to roll inverted and dive to avoid being cut in half. But as I pulled out of the dive, I found myself perfectly positioned for a deflection shot. The P-400's 37mm cannon spoke once, and the Zero's wing root exploded in a shower of aluminum and fuel. The fighter rolled over and dove straight into the jungle below, marking another victory for the wrong plane that the British hadn't wanted. Splash 10, I called, but there was no time to celebrate. 2 more Japanese fighters were diving on me from above, and behind them I could see the bomber formation beginning their attack runs on Henderson Field. For the next 20 minutes, I fought the most desperate air battle of my life. The Japanese pilots were good, some of them were very good, but they'd made a crucial mistake. They'd brought too many fighters and not enough fuel. After flying 300 miles from Rabaul, they were already running low on gas, and the intense maneuvering of air combat was burning through what they had left. I caught my second Zero in a climbing turn, the pilot trying to use his aircraft's superior maneuverability to get on my tail. But the P-400 was faster in a dive, and I'd learned to use gravity as a weapon. Rolling over, I dove on him from above, my cannon and machine guns chattering. The Zero came apart like a broken toy, pieces of wing and fuselage spinning toward the ocean below. But before I could savor the victory, another Japanese fighter was on me, its pilot aggressive and skilled. This one was different. His Zero bore special markings, a red stripe down the fuselage, and what looked like cherry blossoms painted on the engine cowling. This was one of their aces, a veteran pilot who'd probably been flying combat missions since the attack on Pearl Harbor. We spiraled around each other in a deadly dance, each trying to get inside the other's turn for a killing shot. He was good, maybe better than me in a straight dogfight, but he made the same mistake they all made eventually. He tried to climb. At 15,000 feet, his Zero was still nimble and responsive. But I kept me P-400 down where it belonged, in the thick air where the supercharger could do its job. When he finally stalled out and had to dive, I was waiting. The 37mm cannon was a devastating weapon when it connected, and this time it connected perfectly. The explosive shell hit the Zero just behind the cockpit, and the entire aircraft simply disintegrated in a ball of flame and debris. "That's 3, I muttered, but the satisfaction was tempered by what I could see happening around me. Several American fighters were down, some spinning toward the jungle trailing smoke, others simply gone, their pilots hopefully hanging beneath parachutes somewhere in the green hell below. But we were giving as good as we got. The sky was full of burning Japanese aircraft, their pilots bailing out or riding their planes down to destruction. More importantly, the bomber formation was being torn apart by the P-38s and Wildcats at higher altitude. Got another Betty, called Captain Morrison as his burst of cannon fire sent a Japanese bomber spinning out of formation, one wing burning like a torch. "Make that 2. That was Lieutenant Rodriguez in one of the new P-38s, his twin-engine fighter perfectly suited for bomber interception. The Japanese formation was falling apart. What had started as a perfectly organized attack was turning into a scattered rout as American fighters slashed it through their ranks. Bombers were going down in flames, fighters were running low on fuel and ammunition, and the survivors were beginning to think more about getting home than completing their mission. But they weren't giving up without a fight. A formation of 6 Zeros dove on me out of the sun, their leader clearly determined to take down at least one more American before heading home. I rolled and dove, using my P-400's superior speed to stay ahead of them, but they were persistent. The chase led us down to wave-top level, all 7 aircraft screaming across the blue waters of Ironbottom Sound at full throttle. The Japanese pilots were good, but their Zeros were running on empty, and the Allison engine in my P-400 was still giving me full power. One by one, they began to fall behind. The first one simply ran out of gas and had to ditch in the ocean, his fighter sinking beneath the waves in a matter of seconds. The second one tried to turn back for home, but didn't make it. His engine quit halfway to Rabaul, and he joined his wingman in the water. The other 4 made it back to their formation, but they were flying on fumes and praying they had enough fuel to make it home. Many of them didn't. Over the next hour, as the survivors of the Japanese formation limped back toward Rabaul, our coast watchers reported dozens of enemy aircraft going down in the ocean, their pilots exhausted and their fuel tanks empty. When the last Japanese fighter disappeared over the horizon, I did a quick count of the American aircraft still in the air. 23 out of 30 had made it through the battle, not bad odds against overwhelming numbers. But the real victory was what we'd done to the enemy. "Cactus Control, this is Cactus Lead." Major Smith's voice crackled over the radio. "Request damage assessment on Henderson Field. Cactus led, Cactus Control. Minimal damage to Thief Field. The Japs dropped maybe 20 bombs total before you boys broke up their formation. Runway is fully operational, and all facilities are intact. Minimal damage." After sending nearly 200 aircraft to destroy Henderson Field, the Japanese had managed to crater a few taxiways and knock out some minor buildings. Meanwhile, we shot down at least 30 of their fighters and maybe 15 bombers, aircraft, and pilots they couldn't afford to lose. As I circled the field for landing, I could see smoke columns rising from the jungle where Japanese aircraft had crashed. In the distance, more smoke marked the spots where enemy planes had gone down in the ocean. It looked like a graveyard, and in a way, it was the graveyard of Japanese air power in the South Pacific. The landing was routine, almost anticlimactic after the intensity of the air battle. My P-400's engines ran smoothly as I taxied toward the revetments where the ground crews were already waiting with fuel trucks and ammunition loaders. "How'd we do, Lieutenant?" asked Sergeant Wilson, my crew chief, as I climbed out of the cockpit. I looked around at the other pilots gathering for debriefing, counting the familiar faces and noting the empty spaces where friends should have been. We lost 7 pilots that day, good men who'd given their lives to keep Henderson Field operational and the Japanese Bay. But we'd won. For the first time since the war began, we'd met the Japanese in the air with roughly equal numbers and superior tactics, and we'd sent them home beaten and demoralized. The myth of Japanese invincibility was broken, shattered by American pilots flying aircraft that weren't supposed to be able to compete with the legendary Zero. "We did good, Sergeant," I said finally. "We did real good." December 7, 1942. Exactly 1 year after Pearl Harbor, I stood on the beach at Henderson Field watching a convoy of American ships unloading supplies and reinforcements. The Japanese were still on Guadalcanal, still fighting desperately in the hills and jungles around the airfield, but their back was broken. The daily air raids had stopped. Their navy no longer controlled the waters around the island. Most importantly, they were no longer capable of launching the kind of massive aerial assault that had once threatened to drive us into the sea. The P-400 Airacobra had been retired from frontline service, replaced by newer, better fighters, F-4U Corsairs with their distinctive bent wings and powerful engines, P-38 Lightnings that could climb to 30,000 feet and still fight effectively. The age of the cast-off fighter was over, but not before it had done its job. I thought about Tommy Kowalski and the other pilots we'd lost during those desperate months when Henderson Field was all that stood between the Japanese and complete control of the South Pacific. They'd died flying aircraft that were supposedly obsolete, facing odds that should have been impossible, fighting a battle that most people back home didn't even know was happening. But they'd won. We'd won. Not because we had better planes or superior numbers, but because we'd refused to give up when giving up would have been the logical thing to do. We'd taken the hand we were dealt and played it better than anyone had a right to expect. Major Smith found me there on the beach as the sun was setting over Ironbottom Sound, painting the water red and gold. He looked older than he had 6 months ago, with new lines around his eyes and gray streaks in his hair that hadn't been there when we first arrived. Command of a fighter squadron in combat will do that to a man. "Thinking about the boys we lost?" he asked. "Among other things. I keep wondering what would have happened if we'd had proper fighters from the beginning, F-4Fs or P-38s instead of those beat-up P-400s. Smith was quiet for a moment, watching a destroyer escort disappear over the horizon. "Maybe we would have won faster," he said finally. "Maybe we would have lost fewer pilots. But maybe not. The thing about the P-400 was that it made us work harder, think smarter, fight as a team instead of relying on superior equipment." He turned to look at me, those pale eyes reflecting the dying sunlight. "You know what I think, Jack? I think they sent us exactly the right airplane for the job we had to do. It wasn't the plane we wanted, but it was the plane that taught us how to win." I thought about that as the convoy finished unloading and the ships disappeared into the gathering darkness. The P-400 Airacobra would never be remembered as one of the great fighters of World War II. Military historians would write about the Mustang and the Thunderbolt, the Corsair and the Lightning, aircraft that dominated the skies in the later years of the war when American industry was running at full capacity and our pilots had the luxury of superior equipment. But for a few crucial months in 1942, When the outcome of the Pacific War hung in the balance, a handful of Marine pilots flying the wrong plane had held the line at Guadalcanal. We'd proven that American airmen could fight and win against the best the enemy had to offer, even when the odds were stacked against us. The Japanese never again launched the kind of massive air attacks that had characterized the early days of the Guadalcanal campaign. They'd lost too many experienced pilots, too many irreplaceable aircraft. By early 1943, they were on the defensive throughout the Pacific, and they never regained the initiative. Henderson Field became a major airbase, home to hundreds of American fighters and bombers that would carry the war to the Japanese home islands. The crude dirt strip that we defended so desperately was eventually paved and expanded with proper hangars and maintenance facilities and all the amenities of a modern military airfield. But I always remembered it the way it was in those early days. A muddy runway hacked out of a coconut plantation, defended by a handful of pilots flying cast-off fighters and held together by determination, improvisation, and the kind of courage that comes from knowing you're fighting for something bigger than yourself. They sent us the wrong plane, but we flew it anyway, and we won. In the end, that's what mattered. Not the specifications in the technical manuals or the opinions of the procurement officers back in Washington, but the fact that when our country needed us to hold the line, we held it. When they needed us to fight impossible odds with inadequate equipment, we fought and won. That P-400 Airacobra was retired from combat duty in early 1943, its place taken by newer, more capable fighters. Most of the surviving aircraft were shipped to training bases in the United States, where they served out the war teaching new pilots the basics of flight and combat. A few were preserved in museums, silent witnesses to a time when American pilots in the wrong plane saved the Pacific War. But the real monument to the P-400 and the men who flew it isn't made of aluminum and steel. It's made of memory, the memory of what ordinary Americans can accomplish when they're fighting for something they believe in, even when the odds are against them and the equipment isn't perfect and the mission seems impossible. We were just a handful of Marine pilots flying cast-off fighters from a muddy airstrip on a forgotten island. But for 6 months in 1942, we held the line between freedom and tyranny in the Pacific. And that's a memory worth preserving. Lieutenant Jack Morrison survived the Guadalcanal campaign and went on to fly F-4U Corsairs in the later Pacific campaigns. He was credited with 12 aerial victories during his combat service and was awarded the Navy Cross, the Distinguished Flying Cross, and 3 Air Medals. After the war, he returned to his home state of Texas, where he worked as a commercial pilot and flight instructor. He passed away in 1998, one of the last surviving veterans of the Henderson Field fighter squadrons. VMF-223, the Marine fighter squadron featured in this account, was awarded the Presidential Unit Citation for its actions at Guadalcanal. The squadron shot down 110 enemy aircraft during its deployment to Henderson Field, while losing 14 pilots killed in action. Major John L. Smith, the squadron commander, was awarded the Medal of Honor for his leadership during the campaign. The Bell P-400 Airacobra, derided by many as unsuitable for air-to-air combat, proved its worth in the hands of determined pilots fighting under desperate circumstances. While it was soon replaced by more capable aircraft, its service at Guadalcanal demonstrated that victory depends not just on superior equipment, but on the skill, courage, and determination of the men who operate it. Henderson Field, carved from a coconut plantation by American engineers and Marines in August 1942, became one of the most important air bases in the Pacific War. From this humble beginning as a dirt strip defended by a handful of fighters, it grew into a major facility that launched thousands of sorties against Japanese positions throughout the Solomon Islands and beyond. The Battle of Guadalcanal, of which the air campaign was a crucial component, marked the turning point of the Pacific War. For the first time, American forces had met the Japanese in sustained combat and emerged victorious, proving that the empire of the rising sun was not invincible. The lessons learned in those desperate months would guide American strategy for the remainder of the war, ultimately leading to victory in the Pacific.